So, welcome to the LSE for this evening's hybrid event hosted by the European Institute at the LSE, by the Center for Economic Transition Expertise, and the LSE SU European Society. My name is Angelo, and I am an assistant professor in European and International Political Economy at the European Institute here at the LSE. And I'm very pleased to be joined by Reiner, Piroska Nagy Mohacsi, and Agnieszka Smoleńska here. While online we have Atanas Pekanov. I will probably introduce our speakers shortly, but before I do so, I would like to ask those of you in the theater to please put your phones on silent so as not to disrupt the event. The event is being recorded and will hopefully be made available as a podcast subject to no technical difficulties. As usual, there will be the chance for you to put your questions to our speakers in Apple Trans. For our online audience, you can submit your questions by the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and please include your name and affiliation. For those of you here in the theater, I will let you know when we will open the floor for questions. Please raise your hand and wait for the stewards with the roving microphone to get to you. And please let us know again your name and affiliation. We try to ensure region questions from both our online audience and our audience here in the theater. For those X users, the hashtag for today's event is hashtag LSEI. For the Blue Sky users and for Facebook threads, Instagram threads, I think the hashtag should still be the same, but you're welcome again to use whatever you prefer. Now, let me introduce the speakers. Here we have Reiner, who is Executive Director at the National Bank of Slovakia. He's former ECB, where he spent quite a considerable amount of time, 18 years. Next to him, we have Agnieszka Smoleńska, who is a Senior Policy Fellow at the Center for Economic Transition Expertise, which sits within the LSE Institute. Next to me on my right, there is Piroska Nagy Mohacsi, who is a visiting professor here at the LSE. And online, we have Atanas Pekanov, who is a monetary economist at WIFO Wien and former Deputy Prime Minister of Bulgaria. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us on this panel. Now, this year it is 25 years, actually, since 12 EU countries merged their currencies and the euro was born. It took another 3 years, as you know, for the euro to come into circulation in the form of banknotes and coins. When I was preparing the notes for these very short opening remarks, I remember an event we organized actually in 2021, was only online, as you might remember, because of COVID. And there we invited a number of guests, including Paul de Grauwe, Martin Wolf, and Walter Schelke. And we were looking at different ways to analyze, what happened to the euro, whether it was a success, whether we can actually call it, the project euro actually worked. And we analyzed it through different criteria. The first one was actually, what are really the indicators we should be looking at in order to assess the success of the euro? Is it the more traditional ones, inflation or employment? Or is it the new ones like climate change, inequality, or more recently the introduction of digital currency? So in a way, there we try to understand what's the score we can provide to the strategy so far and the future actions that could be taken. But also we looked at the issue of fragility. That's something that you associate a lot with the EU and then with the euro at some point in time. And it was Paul de Grauwe's point about the fragility of the euro. Can we call it endemic or is it temporary at the time? And whether the loopholes in the architecture after the 2012 sovereign debt crisis had actually been addressed. And finally, we looked at the sovereign debt crisis, which highlighted how much the fate of the euro is actually linked to the actions of a strong central bank, the ECB. And when the pandemic struck, it actually seemed that a much faster reaction time we had a much faster reaction time. And in a way, how much the fate of the Eurozone was actually linked to the fate of the single market. Now, more recent events have actually taken a completely different direction. Still, I think we put a lot of emphasis and a lot of the discussions to think about the Draghi report or the Letta report are much more on the single market than on the euro. And so I think it's interesting to look at the perspective again for euro adoption in Central and Eastern Europe to understand both whether, what is the public debates in these countries, but also on the fate of the euro per se. And I think we have a great panel tonight, this evening, in order to understand what is the case for the euro adoption. Now, each speaker will be asked a very specific question and relating to the overall theme, and we'll have maximum 10 minutes to respond. We will start with Reiner Martin. And my first question is, you have a double hat in a way. Having been both at the ECB and now at the National Bank of Slovakia, the only country actually in the Visegrad group which adopted the euro, following a very interesting journey from reform lager to joining the EU relatively early. Could you perhaps try to provide both perspectives? So summarize a bit the general expectations from the ECB side and then focus on Slovakia's journey, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Angelo, and thank you very much for all of you to come here. I'm impressed that this triggers such a lot of interest. I think it's really, really great. So I'll start with my ECB hat, former ECB hat, and let me give you maybe a little bit, just to be very boring at the beginning, give you a bit of an overview of what these criteria actually are. So when can you adopt the euro as a country? Because I'm not sure everybody is familiar with that. And essentially, there are 4 economic criteria. The first one is that your inflation rate over a 12-month period has to be the average of, not above the average of the 3 lowest, plus 1.5%. That's price stability. Second is sound fiscal performance. So 3% deficit, 60% debt, or it goes in that direction. If it's far above, it's a possibility. The third is you need to be a member of the ERM2, that's the exchange rate mechanism tool. So you have fixed your exchange rate to the euro. The fourth is that your long-term interest rates must not be too high. Again, there is a formula I'm not going to bore you with, because that's not a particularly important criterion, at least in history. Didn't turn out to be very important. And the last one is that your legal apparatus relating to the central bank must be in line with European requirements. Okay, now it gets hopefully a little bit more interesting. But I thought that was important just to get that out of the way. All right, so let me give you a little bit more on the process, and then I'll give you my view on how I saw the role of the ECB in this process and the expectations during the almost 10 years that I worked on this topic at the ECB. So first thing to recall is there are 2 institutions involved. There is the ECB and there is the European Commission. Both write convergence reports, but the Commission is actually in a stronger position in this game. Why? Because they prepare the draft opinion for the European Council, where it says country X is recommended to join. ECB doesn't do that. So, but the reports are typically aligned, more or less, right? So actually very closely, most of them. So, becoming a bit more general, how would I characterize this? I thought about a fitting description, how the ECB views this process. And I think I would say it's a technocratic approach. It's also a thorough approach, and it got more thorough during the years. But it's also overall supportive. And I know some people may disagree with me on this. They may say, okay, the ECB is overly critical. But I don't think so. At least this is not how I experienced it when I was there. So there is a long-term goal of unity between the European Union and European Monetary Union. And this is there in the ECB. So overall, I would say it's a supportive approach. Now, ECB had different degrees of caution when it comes to admitting new members during the 25 years of its existence. And I think this is understandable because during the first 10 years, so up to the global financial crisis, if you look at Central Eastern Europe, this was a period where growth was extremely buoyant. There were frothy economic developments, and there was a real risk of boom and bust development and boom and bust effects in some of these countries. And this was, of course, recognized at the ECB. So hence there was a worry that, for example, inflation would not be sustainably low. Right? And hence there was a little bit of the apprehension at this time about admitting new member states. But of course, if they fulfilled all the criteria, they were admitted. So then now you have a different atmosphere, what I perceive at least, or when I also talk to colleagues there. And this is due, I think, to two things. One, there are structural changes in the countries that would like to adopt the euro. So to give you an extreme example, I think when Poland, for example, joined the EU, its per capita average income was around 25-30% of the EU. Now it's somewhere 65-70, something like this. So there's a huge catching up process for all of these countries. And that makes it, of course, a lot easier for these countries to adopt the euro. So things like inflation differentials due to Balassa-Samuelson effect and the like, that is much less of a concern. And I think the third issue is also that the ECB has become a lot more mature during these 25 years. And mature meaning, well, we went through a lot of crises, right? The global financial crisis, the euro area crisis, COVID, the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, you name it. And somehow it was all managed, right? And I think this gives you also a lot more confidence that if there are other countries joining, where maybe not everything is super perfect as you would like it, that this is less of a concern. So this is purely my personal opinion. I'm no longer at the ECB, but this is a bit the perception that I have. So the criteria itself, they did not really change during these 25 years. They are enshrined in the treaty. There was a short period of time when people talked about changing these criteria. This was during the sovereign debt crisis. But this discussion didn't go very far because people soon realized, okay, that means treaty change. Treaty change in the European Union is a massive endeavor. You don't want to come close. But what is happening is that the framework of analysis has become a lot more sophisticated over the years. And there's a lot more of different variables that are now looked at and so on. But the criteria are still the same. One final point, and then I put on my second hat, the Slovak hat. And that's a little less understood, I think, but it's very important. ERM2 membership became a far more important waypost on this journey to the euro than people had expected. Why is that? So you need to be a member of ERM2 for 2 years, and the accession process to ERM2 is much less formalized than the convergence process. There's good reasons for this, because ERM2 is about exchange rate. Exchange rates are affected by many dimensions, many economic developments, political developments, and so on. We all know that. So this is why that process is more fluid. And for some countries, this became an obstacle as we went along. I think for good reasons. There was no, malign will to block anything. But that made it a little bit less predictable, the timetable. So now I put on my other hat, the Slovak hat. So I've been working there for 2 years now. But of course, I have I think a reasonably good idea of how it's perceived, and also looking back, what were the effects of the euro on Slovakia. And I would say that is a big success story, pretty unambiguously. Why is it a big success story? Well, first of all, you have, of course, the standard textbook benefits of the euro. What are those? You have no transaction costs any longer with your major trading partners. You don't have the exchange rate risk any longer. You don't have the risks that even as an advanced emerging market economy you face, which is capital flow reversal if there is, for example, political instability in it. So all of these things are gone, and that in itself is a great thing for Slovakia. Now, there's a much more nuanced discussion about what is the impact on real convergence, on growth. Has the country grown faster as a result of adopting the euro? I would say yes, because, for example, if you think about FDI coming into a country in the region, having the euro is it's a benefit, right? So investors look at that and say, okay, no transaction risk, that is happening. But it's not a game changer. So when it comes to growth, when it comes to real convergence, there are many, many issues at play. And I would say the euro is positive, but it's not probably the most decisive one. Also, the trade creation effects that one was expecting at the beginning of the euro, I think were a bit overdone. There is some positive effect. You can see that in the literature. There's been many studies on this, but I wouldn't overestimate. But nevertheless, I think that's for me the bottom line on real convergence. Without the euro, Slovakia would now be worse off than it is, for sure. Right. And then finally, I would like to talk briefly about the recent high inflation period that we've all faced. And maybe Piroska will say more about this because we're working on a publication together on that topic. So we looked at how Slovakia and the other three Visegrad countries managed this period of high inflation. Now, none of them managed well. We all had inflation that was very high. It was a big concern, a big problem. But among the four, the performance of Slovakia was still the best. And so the lowest inflation of the four. And it was achieved at the cost that was also much lower. The cost meaning the policy rates, the euro area policy rates, which apply to Slovakia obviously, were much lower than the rates in Czech Republic, in Poland, and in Hungary. Now, you can have a long discussion of why that is. And again, there is many different aspects, but certainly the stability of the exchange rate played a role here. The stability of the trade flows with the other countries played a role. And again, these sort of political considerations impacting exchange rate also played a role. So overall, I would say that episode, and in a way it was the first severe test of inflation that Slovakia faced since joining the euro area, showed quite nicely that the real benefits that you get from monetary autonomy are overestimated. So Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, they have independent monetary policy. They also raised interest rates earlier than the ECB did, but nevertheless, it didn't help them very much. So the de facto impact you have with monetary policy, independent monetary policy, in a small, very open economy, I think is often overestimated. So, bottom line, I think for Slovakia, it was a very good thing to adopt the euro, and it's certainly better off with it than without it.
Thank you very much, Reiner. And thank you for managing to have these two hats and for explaining both the original assessment criteria from the ECB point of view, but also the case for a current EU member. Now, moving to Piroska, you have looked at the issue of euro adoption as part of your work in several organizations, from the IMF to the BRD, and more recently academia. So perhaps you can help us assess this shifting balance of pros and cons that, in a way, Reiner was referring to, of euro adoption for smaller open economies, and in the CE from an economic and governance perspective. Back to the article that is forthcoming that Reiner mentioned. There you are comparing post-pandemic inflation fighting monetary policy in Slovakia, which is an EU member, with that in a non-EU CE countries such as Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, your own country. So what is your perspective?
Thank you very much, Angelo, and hi, everybody. I thought that I would cover two broad set of questions. One would be some broader theoretical arguments, as you asked, and the other is go into a little bit more into the evidence, why I'm saying what I'm saying, and there I will be relying on our joint article that's about to be published with Reiner comparing inflation performance. Because that was really a test in the pudding, right? Countries in real time food inflation and delivered on central bank targets or not. So the shifting pros and cons. Stepping back, I assume everybody knows which are the countries which are in the euro and which are not, but just big picture, stepping back. Out of the 27 EU members, 20 already have the euro, right? 20. So only 7 are outside. One, Denmark has opted out, so that doesn't count. So 6. One is Sweden, and all the others who are not in are in Central Europe. This is why we are discussing this today, right? So we are focusing on Central Europe. But a little bit what I'm going to say, I think, is also applicable to Sweden, and then we cover the whole EU trend for EU adoption. So what are the pros and cons and how they shifted? A main argument for small open economies in the EU not to adopt the euro early on, in Hungary, in Romania, in Poland, in the Czech Republic. And that's about it, because Bulgaria has always been wanting, just looking at the door for a long time. The main argument was that you have the benefit of monetary policy sovereignty. When there is a shock to your economy, you are able to use the exchange rate as a shock absorber, conduct independent monetary policy to any type of shocks, and reap the benefits of that independence. However, what the profession, economic profession has shifted, I think, since the global financial crisis very clearly, is to say that actually the benefits of this monetary policy sovereignty and your ability to act to shocks through exchange rate adjustment has been overstated. And in fact, what we learned is that during crisis, it is quite advantageous to be in a monetary zone where the central bank balance sheet is very big, like the ECB's, where the credibility of the institution is stronger than your own little, the Hungarian central bank or others I mentioned. And therefore, in crisis, it is no longer a huge advantage to be independent and float your exchange rate, which actually can go very, very fast toward depreciation and toward foreign exchange market stress, as we have seen both during the global financial crisis and it's not a benefit to be outside. The benefit is to be inside where you enjoy the ECB balance sheet, the support, the ECB credibility support. So for crisis management, exactly the main reason why you really want to get monetary policy, actually the pendulum of cost and benefits have, to my mind, very clearly shifted toward benefiting being in a bigger monetary zone. So much so that every single country which is outside the eurozone had to rely on the ECB currency swaps, crisis management currency swaps, or repo operations, which is a little bit different to details, but basically a support for your foreign exchange market. They had to rely on ECB currency swaps when you are outside, obviously, the EMU. So you had to rely really on the ECB credibility and balance sheet and support and mercy, if I can put it a little bit more in emotional terms. The ECB during the pandemic was incredibly enlightened in this respect. And this is part of what Reiner elegantly said, the ECB has matured, but the ECB has grown up as a central bank The ECB has grown up as a central bank within its own operation, but it's also grown up as a central bank which is responsible for countries which are utilizing the euro, which are exposed to euro currency risk when it came to crisis, financial sector stress during the pandemic. And the ECB gave, I think, to 6 or maybe 8 countries outside the eurozone, obviously, to Poland, to Hungary, different format, Romania, and even countries outside the EU. Outside the EU, they gave WIFO operations to North Macedonia, to Albania, and the like. So you need a big balance sheet. That's the truth of the matter. And if you believe that crisis will be more frequent, the foreign crisis and the like, then you want to have that support. So it's a clear plus. But also, the region is already very euroized. Not as much as maybe earlier. There has been some currency, local market development, which is very good. But prices are in many countries are in euro for major assets. Loans you can still get in euro, and as for savings and deposits and loans are also in euro. And if you go to southern Europe, so not members of the EU, but Albania and North Macedonia, 2 countries actually have unilaterally adopted the euro, and the others are in the EU. So very strong economic arguments in theory. Now, what is the practice? And then let me quickly show a few charts from our new article. Hopefully managing the so this is comparing inflation performance, and I'm just really now underpinning what Reiner told us. This is headline inflation. Let's focus on the left-hand side, so not core inflation, but left-hand side headline inflation. The green line that you see is Hungary's inflation, headline inflation CPI. Obviously, record holder. My own home country, hitting over 25% in 2023, and the others are Slovakia, the Czech Republic, and Poland. Now, why we are looking at this inflation performance and the policies underlying it? We are looking at it because we have seen what you would call, or we would call in academia, a natural experiment. The sources of external shocks, particularly coming from exposure to Russia, to energy dependence, mainly, but also to some extent still trade and other supplies, is very similar in these countries, in Poland, in the Czech Republic, Hungary, or Slovakia. So you had a very similar supply shock to the region. And for other, also the integration to Europe is very similar. They're members of the similar global supply chain, anchored in Germany and other European partners. So very similar economic structure, hit by the same inflation, but under a very different monetary regime. Slovakia is part of the EMU, and the other 3 having their independent monetary policy. So you can beautifully compare in this controlled environment what this different monetary policy regime delivers to you. So that's why we are looking at these 4 countries. So Slovakia in the EU, the others outside and enjoying glorious in monetary policy independence. So you see that Hungary obviously had the highest inflation, and a lot of this, not going into details, had to do with counteractive fiscal policy, which was really going against what the central bank was trying to do. The others, maybe Slovakia, maybe it's a little bit lower in general, but had very similar, honestly, inflation pattern in this was the shock. If you look at the components, what are the drivers of inflation? Hungary and Slovakia very similar. This is energy, everywhere energy, obviously. But energy and food prices. And that's interesting because both Hungary and Slovakia was hit by a drought system, drought seasons. Now, how the policy, and this is what interests us, how monetary policy has reacted. So the little red line, the belated response of Slovakia, member of the ECB, that they did not increase the central bank policy rate until mid-2022, when inflation already was high in the digit, double digit, sort of Slovakia, I don't even know what it was, but very high. And all the other countries, whereas the countries with the independent monetary policy, truth be told, they did react almost a year earlier. So there was a time benefit, so to speak, right? Slovakia couldn't increase interest rates because they were relying on the whole ECB mechanism and all the debate whether the inflation was temporary or permanent and all the beautiful Korean debates. But in the end, they did not react. Whereas the other three countries did react. And they did react gradually in little steps, maybe that is showing not big time. And Hungary, of course, in response to a very high, the highest inflation rate, they increased interest rates the most, rightly, right? So there is no question. Slovakia acted later as part of the ECB and to a much lesser extent, so didn't have to increase rates. But recall the first chart I showed you, headline inflation was still very similar. So the output cost, so to speak, that Slovakia suffered through this mechanism to address inflation later, and much lower interest rate increases, was much lower and delivered the same inflation performance, broadly speaking, than the other, than Poland and the Czech Republic, and then Hungary, was struggling its own struggle. Quickly, currency movements, I'm not going to go into that, but Poland and Slovakia and Hungary had to depreciate, and here, really what happened is the ECB repo lines. Otherwise, this chart would look materially different. There were very big stresses on foreign exchange markets, both in Poland and Hungary. What is the underlying story? Of course, is the fiscal balance, which was reasonably okay before the pandemic. Then there was a huge pandemic response, understandably, to deal with the uncertainty of that huge global shock. But the fiscal policies, and that's here Hungary sort of fiscal policies remain quite expansionary, and that's what's behind Hungary's outlandish inflation record relative to the other countries. The others started to consolidate already. Now, there is the growth story, of course, convergence. Reiner talked about it already. On the left-hand side, we have seen a very significant convergence, as he described. There is an EU premium for all the countries. It may have slowed, and as the right-hand side panel, but the jury is out whether that real convergence is being impacted by other factors or not. But in terms of monetary policy response, I think the evidence is quite clear that Slovakia, although as part of the common euro project, reacted later. It increased interest rate less, but did not suffer, so to speak. There was no loss due to the lack of monetary policy sovereignty, and in fact, they didn't have to face all the capital flow volatility. They didn't have to face foreign exchange market stress and the like. So the evidence is very clear. The first test of different monetary regimes that it was beneficial for Slovakia to be in the Eurozone.
Thank you very much, Piroska, and thank you for bringing together theory and the empirical evidence to see actually what has happened over the last few years, in particular in these countries. Let's now turn to some of the countries which are not part yet of the EMU, but in which there is a very interesting public debate for Euro adoption. Now, let me first start with Atanas Pekanov. Now, Atanas is joining us online, and we will show you full screen very soon. During your time in government, you were mostly in charge of cohesion and EU funding for Bulgaria, but as Deputy Prime Minister, you were part of the council overseeing Euro adoption, which was led by the finance minister and the Bulgarian National Bank. So could you perhaps give us an insight into the process, but more interestingly, perhaps, into the public debate that this generated?
Perfect. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me and see me well.
Hear you well and you well.
Thank you very much for organizing this. This is an important discussion, and I would like to share a bit of the insights that I got from. I had the honor to serve in numerous technical governments in the last 3 years in Bulgaria as Deputy Prime Minister, yes, for EU funding, but overseeing this topic. And on the other hand, my other hat is that for many years now, as an economist, I've been following this debate. So I was very honored, and it was a huge responsibility to steer this debate. It's an important debate. So my view is that Bulgaria should join the euro area as soon as possible. We should have already achieved that. I'll talk a bit about why that hasn't happened and where are some of the problems. But most broadly, I would say the pros are overweighting the cons by far. But that doesn't mean that there is no fear in the public, that there is not many people that think that the negatives are much more. So I would like actually not to ignore them, but talk a bit about these negatives, some of the fears that are, I would say, widely spread in Bulgaria. So just a bit as a background, Bulgaria has been already pegged to the euro since we introduced the currency board arrangement in 1999. So the currency board arrangement was introduced in amidst a very inflationary period of hyperinflation and very, very high debt. And the currency board served its purpose to calm down market stress, to bring confidence in the country. And it is also a very, I would say, popular institution. It is one of the institutions that I would say shares very, very high acceptance throughout all the population. So basically, I would say the very big part of the Bulgarian population sees the currency board as an anchor of stability that helped us overcome the troubles and the market stress of the 90s, and basically led us to the developments in terms of stability and growth of the last 2 decades. This arrangement is very valuable and has high support, which ironically then for some parts of the population means we shouldn't get out of it. It's not my view, because the currency board for me is just a transitory arrangement. In the end, it shouldn't be that you stay forever in a currency board. So now being in a currency board for 25 years, taking the next step will bring more positives. And what are these positives? So I would say that the positives start by the very basic, which are, okay, the elimination of transaction costs, elimination of currency conversion fees. These are classical things. They might seem small, but they are costs that you're paying each year, basically without any necessity for it. Your currency is completely pegged to the euro, but you still convert. And our estimation was that annually, this is a cost of 300 million, which is mostly borne by firms, which make the conversion all the time when trading. And these are costs that, again, they might seem small, because if you look at the exchange rates, it's a very small percent of any exchanges that you do, but this is a cost that you pay each year. Again, as I say, almost for nothing. The second big benefit of joining for me is what we perceive as basically increase in reputation. That would come most probably also in our discussions with credit agencies with an increased credit rating. And this is what should also lead to lowering of yields on government bonds, and therefore could also lower interest rates. A third very major point previously, now not so much, is enhanced supervision. So for a very long time, joining the euro area was also equal for us, at least I believe, in a very good manner. It was equal to enhanced supervision through the SSM. Now, this argument is not very much in play anymore because we already joined the banking union and basically the supervision is already there, so to say, for free. But it is something that I think is beneficial. And then the final point, but very important point, is basically the reputational effects of being part of the ECB government. So the currency board arrangement now doesn't give us any voice in decisions by the ECB, but due to the currency board, we are basically transmitting the decisions. I'll come to this in a second. By the way, I was very happy to hear the arguments before me because I basically share almost all of them, and I've tried in many different ways to communicate this in Bulgaria because the fears, as I said, the public discussion is very often based on a couple of, I would say, myths or things that people are scared about. The first one is the possible extra inflationary pressure when joining the euro. Empirical studies don't really show a huge boost to price pressures when joining the euro. Most empirical studies show an additional effect of, let's say, 0.2 to 0.4% or even 0.5%. Yes, this is extra inflation, but coming now out of a period where we had 10, 15% inflation, I wouldn't say that any additional inflation of 0.2 to 0.5% should be something that people should be scared about. Of course, anecdotal evidence on some daily goods, for example, when looking at other countries similar to Bulgaria, very often you see in the media, for example, some examples, but they are really individual examples from Croatia. Some goods really increasing, but this I think it's not a general price level change. It's mostly certain goods, certain sectors, certain services, and of course certain firms that are doing this. But it is not an empirically documented phenomenon that once we join the euro, there'll be a huge inflation boost. So for me, this is shouldn't be the real killer. Then there are some entry costs. I wouldn't say that the entry costs are I would say they are negligible. There are, of course, logistical costs, okay, but this is something that you pay once, and then each year you don't pay the transaction costs and the currency conversion fees, so net positive. Then there is one, I would say, big argument about, well, once we enter, the fiscal straitjacket, that is the fiscal rules, will be lower, or somehow we'll be able to forego fiscal discipline. Now, I don't agree with this because Bulgaria has been overly conservative in terms of fiscal discipline for many, many years. This is why we have not in recent 2 years, I would say, but in the years before that, in the decades before that, Bulgaria has been extremely fiscally conservative. So it was much more conservative that the fiscal rules actually implied. That led to the situation that we have the lowest debt to GDP ratio in Europe. And basically, there is no link between joining the euro area and running higher deficits. Yes, of course, you will profit from lower yields, and that will give the government a bit of more space maybe to invest, but actually I wouldn't see this as a problem, because otherwise what we are saying is we want to have the higher yields. That is why we want to stay out of the euro, so that we can penalize ourselves with this higher yield so that we have fiscal discipline. This is not a logical, I think, construct. Now, the final thing, and very important thing, and this is where I hear a lot of people arguing about this, is the idea that somehow by joining the euro area, this is a final step of losing monetary sovereignty. So for me, we don't have monetary sovereignty right now. In the currency board arrangement, the decision on interest rates in Bulgaria are taken by the ECB Governing Council and then transmitted by the Bulgarian National Bank. So actually, by joining the euro area, we will gain sovereignty, because there will be the Bulgarian governor going to the ECB Governing Council meeting and arguing for where he sees impending monetary decisions as the right ones. Whereas right now, we're totally not on the table. So actually, joining will increase our sovereignty and vice versa. Of course, this is connected to the idea that out of a currency board, you can always exit. That is true. But as I said already, I don't think that many people want that. So we are already deeply integrated in the euro area economy, I would say. One argument that was always used against further integration was, okay, the ECB interest rate policy maybe is not suitable to you? Well, actually, if we see business cycle synchronization for Bulgaria, and this is some research that I have done some years ago for the Bulgarian National Bank, well, business cycle synchronization is pretty high in Bulgaria. And we are mostly actually synchronized to the German economy. This is on the supply side because there is a lot of automobile industry in Bulgaria. So basically the developments of the German economy are then easily transmitted also to the Bulgarian economy through the automobile sector. And if we have high business cycle synchronization, it's true my research was before the pandemic. I don't know how this developed since then, but given that all the data that we have shows that we are pretty linked to the Euro area and mostly German business cycle, that basically means that the ECB interest rates are more or less already suitable for us. So we don't want to go out of the currency board, and the step is then going forward. Now, why this hasn't happened yet, which I regret, and I say I believe we have made all the necessary steps to achieve that in the technical governments, also in my role. One thing that was really the big challenge is that, at least for me, and I can say that now openly, the rules in some ways were not devised for a period of 10-15% inflation. Reiner said at the beginning, one of the Maastricht criteria for joining the Euro area is an absolute difference between the best performing countries. But this 1.5% difference to the best performing countries, well, it was designed in the 90s for a time where inflation was, let's say, close to the target. So it is much easier to achieve that when on average inflation is, let's say, 2%, than as it was in the last 2 years, where on average inflation in the Euro area was, let's say, 7, 8, or even 10%. Of course, our inflation was even higher than that, and this is what basically precluded us from fulfilling the Maastricht criteria. So for a very long time, by the way, till the pandemic, Bulgaria fulfilled all the nominal criteria. Now, since the inflation shock, for 2 years, we have not been fulfilling the inflation criterion, and this is what basically meant that the European Commission evaluated us as not yet ready to join. Here, I would say maybe some flexibility would have been good. I think it was unfortunate that this inflation shock basically led to developments partly outside of our control. This is why I also liked the discussion before that and the results that we saw for other countries. Given that you're in such a position of the cycle, basically it was very hard for any single country to overcome this inflationary shock, and this is what led us not to comply with the criteria. Very soon, most probably by the end of this year or the beginning of next year, Bulgaria will be complying with the nominal criteria. So my hope is that there will be movement going forward, and I would say that people should see it as a welcome movement, because in extremely uncertain times, it becomes even more important that you anchor yourself to a strong and credible anchor. And in the end, the euro is the second most important currency in the world. Yes, it is far behind the dollar. That is true if you look at all the statistics, but still, I would say that being packed, but then also part of the second most important currency in the world gives you more basically a more active role and a stronger economic performance than otherwise sitting on the outside. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Atanas, for this great overview and insight into both the process and the public debate in Bulgaria. Let me turn finally to Agnieszka Smoleńska. You are part of this newly established Center for Economic Transition Expertise that sits within the LSE Grant Institute, that, as you know, is the Center on Climate also at the LSE. And you have also written a couple of very interesting reports on the question of euro adoption for Poland, a country which has long been the epitome of transition, but has not joined the EMU. So my question is twofold. What's the case for the euro in Poland, and does the success of the green agenda depend on it?
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this question. It's really a pleasure to be here, pleasure to co-organize and be part of this discussion. So as you mentioned, indeed, within the CETEx, we look specifically at how central banks, finance ministries can support economies in the transition, so financing transition to a more sustainable future. But also, in my personal case, since 2010 or so, I've been following the Euro crisis debate and the debate about Euro in Poland, which is where a lot of the insights that I will share today will come from. But you'll see some convergence between these two hats in my case as well. So I'll try to be mindful of the time. I'm really grateful for this attendance, and I hope this means also we have a lot of motivated people in the room who are eager to restart the discussion in different countries. So I look forward to your questions. What I hope to leave you with after my intervention, and I should also make a disclaimer in this room of economists, I'm a lawyer by background, so I've been following the Euro as an institutional project, especially since 2010, looking at how EMU has transformed. And this is a really critical element to think about from the perspective of thinking about Euro adoption in different member states, right? So I think, and maybe this is also, it's always quite good when panelists disagree. So I would say convergence criteria have changed quite a bit. It's just not in a formal way, but in an informal way. And so I will make the case for how the transformation has affected the calculus in different member states, but also why we need, especially today, given the challenges that all of the economies face in the region relating to sustainability transition, but also institutional rule of law issues, as well as sustainability transition. We need to think about integration, not just through the lens of economics, growth, inflation, but also strengthening the resilience of different and accelerating the transition in the region. So when I started following the debate about Euro in Poland in 2009, 2010, this was the beginning of the financial crisis. In fact, this is how I got into banking regulation in the first place. I was studying here in London, looking at all of the bank bailouts and thinking, what's up with these banks? Why are we saving them? And what have they ever done for me in the past? But since then, when we look at how the Euro has changed, this really has an impact on how we should be thinking about integration. So back then, a lot of the countries in the region were really cautious. Euro incomplete, EMU is not an optimum currency area. Let's see and figure out what these Western Europeans do, and then we will recalculate how we feel about this. And now the last of the reports, in the Polish case in particular, that really in detail look at the economic, institutional, political case about Euro adoption date back to 2014. So there is still this mentality of let's wait and see, which means that in the public debate, especially, this case for Euro has transformed, how we relate to the Euro has changed, and who we are as a country, which Reiner already mentioned, this is the case for a lot of the countries in the region, this has changed. So the starting point for thinking about restarting a discussion about Euro in the different countries in Central and Eastern Europe should really be what has changed. And I will make case for the three dimensions. So first of all, what has changed about the EMU? Now, there will be so many fantastic professors here also at the LSE, like Wojciech Schalke, have done a lot of work critiquing the EMU. Its incompleteness, its impact on austerity policies, especially in Europe's periphery. But when we look at the transformation that has been done within the EMU over the last 15 years or so, it's quite staggering. We have new institutions, we have supervision at the EU level, we have also changes in the balance of power within the EU when it comes to Euro member states versus non-Euro area member states. And one of the important reasons for this is Brexit, which has changed the balance of power also within the Council when it comes to qualified majority voting. So non-Euro area countries for a long time didn't have a blocking minority, but now this is, forget it. In addition, have all of these new dimensions for thinking about currencies, such as the role of the currency in sustainability transition, and I will come back to this, but also increased thinking to something that has been alluded to already about the international role of the euro and how, in a more fragmented geopolitical context, is euro also a source of stability rather than for Europe rather than relying on other currencies. So euro has changed, euro area has changed. Secondly, the relationship between euro and Poland as a country, but this would apply to other countries in the region as well, and the euro area countries has changed. So we see increased synchronization of cycles, but also the criteria for joining have changed. So on paper, when you look at the treaty, of course, well, one change has been made, namely the ESM has been included in the treaty, which is this, the backstop that has been created in the midst of the euro crisis. So we have new bodies, new organizations to which you have to join if you want to join the euro area, a European banking union. Already Bulgaria and Croatia needed to join the banking union 2 years before even thinking about joining the common currency. At the same time as they joined the ERM too. In addition, when you look at because we now understand that euro membership is not just about convergence criteria, it's so much more. You need trust between countries in the euro group. You need you realize that the banking integration has many different dimensions. It's not just about quality of supervision, but it's also about quality of corporate governance. It's your insolvency laws. It's your anti-money laundering rules. So when we look, for example, at the Bulgaria's integration process, and maybe this is something that we can come back to, there is this really fascinating letter with commitments from the Bulgarian government to the Eurogroup, listing promises of reforms that the Bulgarian government will do in order to be considered as a full member of the Economic and Monetary Union, which includes reforms to state-owned enterprises law, anti-money laundering rules, as well as insolvency rules. So, whether this was a list that they came up with on their own, out of their own free will, or was it a part of a negotiation between the member states who had to agree, we can maybe discuss this. But finally, and this is also when it comes to the situation within the countries themselves, so we see a transformation of these countries in terms of wealth, so they get closer to the European average, but we also have this rethinking of the economic models of many countries in the region. So does Central and Eastern Europe just want to be the factory and building the cars, or are we looking for competitiveness also in other areas? And in this context, it's also necessary to explore these new dimensions of euro enlargement. So we, of course, economic convergence, the economic case is strong, but there are also other types of factors we should be thinking about and talking about in the public debate especially. And I will list 3: rule of law, sustainability transition, and security. So starting with security and geopolitical considerations. This has already been one of the major, we don't have Baltics in the room, but already for the Baltics, and there are quotes from Draghi when, Latvia underwent 20% contraction in order to stay pegged to the euro as part of their process. Why? Absolutely security considerations and additional security guarantees that come from being part of the currency union were considerations here. But there are others. So, for example, it might make, if you need to invest a lot of in defense, for example, it might make sense to have a more stable currency exchange if you are importing a lot of heavy machinery, which is now the case in the region. But even more in this What we also saw since the escalation of the war in Ukraine in 2022 is the impact of seeing new tools that central banks have when it comes to the new arsenal, let's say, of sanctions that are possible if you are part of the area versus if you are your own regime. So ECB has played a big role also in freezing of Russian assets. So the toolbox that you have in this context of weaponized interdependence, and I'm sure many of you have come across this term, is completely different if you are within the currency area than outside. And this is just, I'm not, there are obviously different ways you can look at this dimension, but it should be absolutely part of the discussion in the region. Secondly, the rule of law dimension. So if several countries in Central and Eastern Europe are having some problems with institutional backsliding and what it means, and we always focus on the judiciary when we discuss institutional backsliding, but the corruption of institution goes much further. And in fact, if you look at the budgetary processes, I remember quite a few cases over the pandemic, especially where as part of the budgetary process, there would be some weird amendments giving amnesty to guys linked to the political party. So how you can also look at Euro area integration is through these lens of institutional rebuilding. Strengthening of institutions linked to budgetary and fiscal processes. This is probably something that few colleagues who are following the Euro debate in especially Greece or Spain would perhaps find it surprising. But once you really lose any kind of transparency around the budgetary processes, the guarantees that come with Euro membership in terms of mutual surveillance, but including also the increased transparency of these processes, for example, through fiscal councils, becomes all the more apparent. So in this one report that we wrote with a colleague, we in fact see this case for anchoring Poland's Euro area adoption in the context of rebuilding of institutions following the rule of law backsliding period. And finally, the sustainability transition dimension. So there is an obvious case that relates to the cost of capital if you need investment. And in Poland, the estimates are around 2 trillion euro. It's gigantic. So much of the economy needs to transform. And obviously, higher cost of capital means it's more expensive, right? And therefore it's harder. So you end up in this kind of trap where you need to transition because of the commitments, imperative of climate crisis, but all of this is more expensive to you because you have the currency which is lower in the hierarchy. But it's beyond the cost of capital dimension. There is something else that is also happening within the euro, and that relates to the coordination between financial regulation policies and sustainable finance, monetary policies of the ECB, and the role that EU budget also plays in terms of the European Commission now also plays as participant in the market through the issuance of green bonds. So we see within the euro area, there is a different constellation of actions done by institutions that leads to a different macro financial regime when it comes to that underpins sustainability transition, that relies on private markets in a different way within the euro area than outside. And this also is another dimension in which this potentially more expensive cost of the transition outside of the euro area is visible. Now, mindful of the time, I think this is where I would leave it at that I think it's really important to think whilst the discussion is stalled, and in the Polish context, I don't see it being blocked in the near future for many reasons, political, but also legal, Also links to who is now the head of the Polish Central Bank. Poland is in the excessive deficit procedure. So in terms of the criteria, this is not a short-term program. But there is a very strong case for starting to think long-term about what integration means in terms of preparation of institutions in the country already, and how thinking about euro area adoption can be linked also to a rethinking of the growth model for the medium term, how this process can underpin strengthening of resilience of the country in the context of the very specific challenges that the region faces.
Thank you very much. So this closes the round of interventions from our speakers. I want to try to summarize all the different points that have been made for euro adoption and the case for euro adoption. I think we're leaning a bit towards the benefits and the positives of euro adoption here. So we would like to hear from you now. What are your questions and your point of view, and both here and online? We have roaming mics, so just raise your hand and let us know whether you would like to ask a question, to whom that question is directed, or whether it's for the whole panel. And please state your name and affiliation. We have a question.
Thank you. I'm Nora, master student in political economy of Europe program. Shall I have two questions?
Yeah.
Okay, so the first I would like to address to Mrs. Piroska Nagy Mohacsi. If I would like to ask you, do you agree that the huge diversion in Hungary's inflation rate could largely be attributed to the price caps, or would you stress
The price
caps?
caps,
Yeah, or would you stress other factors?
Yeah.
Or like, should I go with the second?
Yeah, just go ahead.
Okay.
with the second.
For the second one, I was wondering it in parallel to Slovakia. Says Hungary recently would form its political economy often to favor or in favor of specifically the German car industry. And it would be an argument that euro adoption would harm the country's competitiveness. At a point saying that like a weak Hungarian currency would actually be bad for the country. So if like my question would be if it really would be that harmful for the country's competitiveness in this sense, or if it really could be a consideration behind the country's euro adoption if it once becomes a realistic prospect.
Thanks. Maybe we take another. There was the hand there in the right. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Mariano, master student as well. Thank you for the presentation. First of all, I see, of course, the evidence from the studies. I was just wondering, considering, for example, the Greek crisis, would you say that on another level we can also take into account the point of view of countries still member of the euro of the money of the EMU? So would you say that taking into account their perspective as well might be challenging, or in the sense that they might fear the integration of new countries, considering, for example, the Greek crisis, and now it underscored the risk of exchange rate volatility and inflation pressure?
For the whole panel.
Yeah, and if the ECB at least has undergone some changes within the institution as well to manage this government crisis as well. Thank you.
Let me take the last question. Then we.
So my question is more targeted to Mr. Pekanov, but I guess anyone can answer it for their countries. It's, as we know, Atanas Pekanov's work on the role of institutions shows economic institutions are central to a country's growth trajectory and long-term growth. So how do you see, Mr. Pekanov, the role of Bulgaria's institutions in the process of euro accession and also convergence? And do any particular ones stand out as hindering or helping the process, especially in light of recent political instability?
So we have. Let's start with these four questions. So Piroska, maybe you start with Dora's question on price caps and competitiveness for Hungary.
Yes. Yes. So the price caps, well, theoretically, I mean, the idea behind that was it was introduced in Hungary, Poland, in other countries as well, right? that you stop inflation, price gouging, by introducing a limit or freezing prices. The evidence, not only in Hungary but elsewhere, Argentina, for example, which the real model, real life, long-term model for this type of practice is that it doesn't really help stopping inflation, and it introduces a lot of distortions, which then the government tries to counterbalance with other policies. In the case of Poland, for example, the IMF estimated that on the short run, back in 2022, price caps kept inflation down by 4 percentage points, but then it evaporated because obviously people go around. In Hungary, we have evidence that price X is capped, but price Y, which is a close substitute, of course, then increases prices. So it doesn't work. Now, what I'd like to maybe also point out more broadly is that I think the Hungarian case is clearly one where you have to, it focuses your mind that you really have to look at the policy mix. So it's one set of policies that the central bank does in the face of high inflation. They introduce early the policy tightening, perhaps convoluted because they continued quantitative easing, but they did the right thing and early on. But at the same time, the government was capping, interest rates, right? Common shock interest rates. So you cap interest rates for ex-lenders and borrowers, other often, your cronies, right? In this sector and that sector, and happens to be a friend of X and Y, then you block the transition mechanism that would really allow for monetary policy to work through and contain demand and thus ultimately reduce inflation. So I think the Hungarian case is not simply the price cap, the ineffectiveness, but where government policy goes so blatantly against what the central bank is trying to do. And as a result, this uncoordination, you get a mess and you have the highest inflation in Europe. Now, on a weak currency, this is a very long debate, right? Sort of whether your devaluation helps your competitiveness or not on the long term. So I think the answer is that it can help on the short term, and it's not going to help you on the long term because prices do catch up. In Hungary, what is the coefficient with which you adjust your internal prices to evaluation is still very high. It can be high. So, and the expectations are such that you will adjust internal prices, wages will adjust. There are some other complicating sectors because there is labor shortage, right? So that will be pressuring wages anyways, and then if you want it, you can have a fancy argument that you can accommodate that through depreciation. But I don't think on the long term it works. And you can, show me one country where it has worked. Depreciation, including Italy, sort of never worked. You depreciate, prices catch up, wages catch up, you depreciate, blah, 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 and you get into this never-ending circle. So that, that's not really a serious economic argument.
Thank you. Before we actually take the question on if I understand the question correctly, on the view from the Western countries, more that are part of the EU, that probably the two of you can also from the how the institutional changes and the ECB, the former ECB can take. Let's dive into Bulgaria, Atanas, if you agree. Let's take the question on Bulgaria, if you agree.
Yes, perfect. So, my view has always been critical in the sense that Bulgaria has taken a path in the last 2 or 3 decades of, let's say, a relatively small state, relatively low taxes, and therefore relatively small and, for me, weak institutions. So, on that sense, I would say we are not where we should be. And by the way, I have seen this as a very practical. So, we know the Semoglu story, and it is completely right. In the long term, institutions are crucial, but I can already say that even in the short run, one can see the practical challenges of having, let's say, relatively small institutions. For example, now all of a sudden, with the introduction of Next Generation EU, with a very big fiscal tool that was introduced at the EU level as a response to the pandemic, and I was in charge of it in Bulgaria. Some member states receive a lot of funding, and Bulgaria is one of the biggest recipients of these funds. To receive those funds, they have to do, I would say, very, very broad reforms. It's true that some of the reforms are in the area of the rule of law, in the green transition. They are the most salient ones. They are the ones that you see in the news. But actually, Next Generation EU and the national recovery plans, they actually have reforms in all sectors of the economy. And if you don't have strong institutions, you're not able to implement these reforms either correctly or not at all, I would say. So some of the things that we agreed with the European Commission to be implemented as part of the Bulgarian Recovery and Resilience Plan now are basically facing the issue that the institutions in charge, these are, for example, different ministries, don't have the capacity, don't have the knowledge, don't have the personnel to implement them. And I can give a very, so people, again, people think about the rule of law and justice reform, extremely important, yes, but you need more of a political will to go. There are some reforms that you just need strong institutions to be done, for example, in the social sector. And if you don't have strong institutions, you just can't do it in the short run. So weak institutions become a challenge for growth, not only in the long run as we think about it in macro and economic growth, but even in very short and practical terms. So I'm critical to this, but it doesn't change from one year to the other. And if I may add, I wanted to add something else on the other question, which was related to the let's say the austerity period and the Greek crisis. I would say that well, Next Generation EU is one of the tools that we introduce so that we don't go again in the same situation as we went 10 or 15 years ago, right? Next Generation EU was introduced exactly to calm down financial market stress during the pandemic. I think it achieved this. It also was created to provide some short-term fiscal stimulus and also to basically try to protect long-term public investment in some areas, in infrastructure, in the Green Deal, as soon as fiscal consolidation times come. So basically, now we are also seeing part of the idea behind Next Generation EU, because sooner or later, after the shock, you have to enter fiscal consolidation period. We see this, and most probably it is needed in some member states. But to have public investments protected, you need some tool to basically ensure they will continue, and they will not be the first thing that gets dismissed, which normally happens in a fiscal consolidation. So I think the EMU actually learned a lot of the lessons, of the unpleasant lessons of the relatively weak economic growth and very low inflation period of the aftermath of the global financial crisis. On one hand, on the fiscal side, by having this fiscal tool, and of course also on the monetary side by creating the transmission protection instrument. The ECB is also kind of going where maybe we should have gone 10 years ago.
Thank you, Adam. Maybe Reiner and then Agnieszka on the question of the view from the inside, the EMU.
Sure. I'd just like to say one thing on this competitiveness, because so Slovakia has now the euro for 15 years. And I just had recently an interesting discussion with somebody working in the automotive industry in Slovakia. And the cost of 1 hour of a worker in an automotive factory in Slovakia is currently 50% of what you pay in Germany. So I think this is pretty competitive, right? After 15 years of having the euro. And I think you were very diplomatic, but I think this devaluation strategy to preserve competitiveness does not help you in the long run. It's only a short term as a sort of instrument to buffer a shock. Anyway, on institutions, this was a big change indeed. And I mean, you mentioned the Greek crisis. What that triggered was the creation, in particular, of the banking union and of the SSM and of the Single Resolution Board. Unfortunately, not yet the deposit insurance, but at least these first two pillars are there. And that is the biggest difference, I think. And this is also why it's now the whole edifice is now more solid than it used to be. There were a lot of pretty smart thinkers already 20 years ago who said, well, monetary union cannot work without a single supervision. They were ignored at the time. It took a big crisis to get that sorted, but now it's sorted. That's a good thing. And then, of course, also, Agnieszka, to your point on the things have changed. Yes, to some extent they have changed because these institutional changes are, of course, reflected. You need to reflect. But the basic economic criteria have not changed. And you have now a lot more indicators, a lot more references in the report. But let's not be mistaken, these are not convergence criteria. These are all additional indicators to try and give you a solid sustainability, forward-looking perspective, but the criteria hasn't really changed. And just one final point, if I may, because this is such a wonderful, persistent urban myth, that if you adopt the euro, things get extremely more expensive. As you said, Atanas, all the studies are between 0.3, 0.5 for all the countries who have done that. And after 1 year, this drops out. This is a mechanical effect for 1 year, right? And I think why it is so long lasting is that those items that are particularly affected are those that you use a lot. The coffee, the famous espresso in the Italian bar. They still talk about it, right? And when they compare it now with the price in Italian lira, the price they have in mind, obviously, is from 1999. Yes, it got a little bit more expensive. So this is why these things are very, very persistent, but they're not really as serious.
Agnieszka, maybe a word.
Yeah, just on the one thing I wanted to say, I guess we can discuss. Let me put it this way, but on the lessons to be drawn from experiences of other countries, I think this is really important because indeed the Greece argument is really brought up over and over again. What we do in one of these reports with a colleague is to specifically look for lessons in the experiences of different countries, and we differentiate kind of 4 scenarios of more or less successful integration, taking the example of Finland, discussing difficult integration, for example, Italy, blocked path scenario like Sweden, and then we also think about what happens when you kind of drift and we know and kind of stay on the out like Brexit, like the UK and Hungary indeed. So learning lessons from the experiences of other countries is clearly critical, but we mustn't forget how much the institutional framework of the EMU has changed both in terms of the fiscal economic governance, but also doing monetary policy, but also how much the thinking has changed behind what it takes to build sustainable monetary integration, as was mentioned in the context of the response to the crisis. We didn't, tighten the belt when the pandemic hit, right? So at least baby steps.
Thank you. We literally have 5 minutes left. So let's see here if there are any pressing issues. There was a hand up here and a hand, yeah. Yep.
František Bracek, I'm an economist in the UK Treasury. I found your paper really interesting on sort of the benefits that euro adoption for Slovakia brought to kind of reducing inflation there. But my question is, how much of that is down genuinely to kind of euro adoption versus how much of it is down to the reliance of the Slovak economy on the German economy? And would we likely be seeing such an effect in a new EU member state, which kind of adopts the euro as well and isn't as reliant on the German economy as Slovakia is when it comes to kind of decreasing inflation in response to perhaps a bit more of a gradual increase in the interest rate relative to some of the other examples we've seen?
Thank you. Yep, let's take the question here.
Hi, I'm Frank. I study BSc in Politics and Economics here at LSE. I have 2 questions. One broader one. How would you address the criticism of kind of famous economists such as Stiglitz and Mandel about that the monetary union cannot ever be completed without a fiscal union and its flaws? And another kind of specific question to Agnieszka. Do you see any other legal paths for in Poland for euro adoption apart from amending the constitution, which, as you know, it's kind of difficult thing to do?
And not to leave anyone out, I know that there is a hand there. We will try to be give a 1 minute answer each if you can. I know it's tough.
My name is Konstantin. I study political economy of Europe, and I would like to know if you had to pinpoint a year when the other EU countries are going to join the euro, when is that going to be and why?
Nice closing thought. Then maybe we start, who would like to start first? Reiner, would you like to take the question?
The last one was very easy. Honestly, I think Bulgaria, I hope soon, I would agree with you. I think this is the most likely contender now. For the rest, well, there's a mechanical issue, so you have to adopt, you have to join ERM2, so at least you're talking 3 years, and then plus whatever time is needed before. Right, so I think it's not imminent, but I think it's a long process, so the sooner it starts, the better. And on the last, I thought this was also an excellent question, monetary union without fiscal union. Yeah, well, it's 25 years, it's still there. We don't have fiscal union, but we have rules which are certainly not perfect, right? So that it creates tension, but it didn't prevent, it didn't cause monetary union to collapse.
Yeah, I think very quickly on that. Thank you for the question. Indeed, this is one of the big blockages changing the constitution. There are, of course, others like the head of the central bank that is in place until 2026 or 2027. I would say, yes, we need the constitution, but the point is also how do we have discussion about the euro in the country? So it's not just about the legal aspects. It's because it's what what's the point is not to have a minority government adopt euro in 5 years, right? And therefore that's why in one of these reports what we are calling for is to talk about euro adoption as a long-term process of strengthening of resilience, institutional strengthening, coming back to this institutional point, so that it's treated as something that is already integrated in the way that we talk also about the Poland's future within the EU as a whole.
Piroska can then happen.
And no days.
It's the process that commitment. Let me maybe just, what would be my Twitter X or Blue Sky line on this debate? Why are we discussing this after all, right? Why is it emerging as a topic in Central Europe, but also in Sweden? We are discussing it because the real elephant is in the room, we mentioned that the big issue here is that the euro is the only irreversible tool of European integration. We saw the EU was quite irreversible, but then Brexit happened. So if you believe that Europe is being challenged by external shocks or movements from the East, and that's the Russia threat, security threat, as Agnieszka very rightly pointed out, or from the West, because we have a new era of America first. If you want to be part of the European project, and that's for Central Europe and a little bit for Sweden, at the core, being part of the whole thing, irreversibly, that is the euro. The rest, you can always drop out, you can leave, you can vote, etc., etc. Leaving the monetary union is more difficult. I think that's the ultimate motivation, and that's a very stark decision point now for countries and populations to make. Let me just make the final point. We didn't mention that according to the Eurobarometer, which monitors the euro popularity is at its height in member countries, and it's improving also elsewhere, even in Poland. It's a little bit, that strong. But in the end, it's a question how much strong Europe we want in the context of major geopolitical shocks.
Thank you. Atanas, some closing thoughts. I saw you nodding.
Yes, I agree with everything that was said. I wanted to say that, well, the Mundell Cannon logic, it is completely bulletproof. It is completely true, but in the end, it is a model, right? So our reality is much more difficult, I would say, much more complicated. They didn't believe that we will achieve labor mobility. We're, I think, achieving more and more labor mobility. Actually, we have some good examples. Now people go not in labor mobility, not only the way that we think about it, but also the way going from Vienna to work in Bratislava, because wages start converging, right? So this is also something that we thought this will never happen, but it actually is happening, because we are seeing growth in some of the Eastern European countries catching up. And then, yes, we need, I think, in the long term, some kind of fiscal stabilization too. We introduced one in the pandemic. It reduced market stress. It is not permanent, which is an issue. But even so, exactly as Reiner said, we managed to go through many crises in these 25 years. It didn't crumble. Why? Because, well, there are very huge political costs that are maybe not there in the Mundell-Kennan logic. And these political costs, we saw that basically countries in the Euro periphery, they suffered a lot. It was a very hard adjustment for them, and they still stayed. So I would say that even after huge shocks, the willingness to exit, I would say, should be low and is not there. I'm more actually afraid that there could be a willingness to exit more from some of the northern countries, from the so-called strong ones, which will be something very misguided, I would say. But this is the fear that I might have in the long term. Otherwise, I think we can, yes, we can, it's not the perfect solution, but we can continue. And we have seen that we can overcome crisis even without the perfect model tools that optimal currency area tells us we need to have.
Thank you very much. So it's been a great pleasure to have the opportunity, I guess, both me and all of you to listen to this evening's discussion. I would like to thank all those who joined, both here and online, and a special thanks to all our speakers and to the hosting institutions. And have a nice evening.